Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them. We are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop.
What happens when Congress stops asking hard questions, while taxpayer money keeps burning by the day? In a tense Senate exchange, a lawmaker didn't just challenge the administration's Venezuela policy. They sounded the alarm on something much bigger, a breakdown of oversight, accountability, and constitutional balance. While millions of dollars flow overseas, while human rights abuses continue abroad, Congress, according to this argument, has been asleep at the wheel. This wasn't just about Venezuela. This was about power. Who checks it? And what happens when no one does?
I just want to start by saying what's plain, frankly, be plain to Senator Rubio and plain to members here, is that it should not have taken this long to have this hearing. Fundamentally, we have a crisis, I believe, in our democracy right now, which is the failure of Congress to do its job, to provide checks and balances, oversight, to provide the kind of constitutionally mandated work that we should be doing to keep a balanced government. We have operations right now that are literally costing the American taxpayer tens of millions of dollars a day. The buildup in the Caribbean alone is hundreds of millions of dollars a month, but we're not providing that kind of oversight that's necessary. So from our power to the purse, to our important work of providing a check and balance to an administration, what we're seeing right now is unacceptable and speaks to what I think is a growing constitutional crisis in our country, which is a Congress that is just lying down for the administration to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. I want to pick up on my colleague's questioning because I actually know from years of conversations with you, your heart about human rights in countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary. And you issued a travel warning, a level 4 travel advisory from your department's website that says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, arbitrary enforcement of laws, crime, and more. And when we hear from the president that he is in charge, that you all are running this government to that extent, I have a lot of concerns when it comes to the rampant human rights violations that are persisting. Cabello is Maduro's key hardline enforcer. He's continued to intimidate and suppress Venezuelan voices. He remains in control of Venezuela's security forces, security services, the colectivos. We're seeing extraordinary examples that the constant oppression of the people is continuing as these folks are remaining in control of the country. So I just want to know, what is the plan to address in a much more aggressive manner these severe human rights violations and to try to stop these armed militias? Because if we are doing things to stabilize their government, if we're turning over resources and money to the very groups that are creating these horrors, that seems to me against America's values, and it seems to me something that is should be unacceptable to Congress on both sides.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening. If you think about travel advisories are us imagining worst-case scenarios. We have a duty to warn American citizens when they travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested. of Americans being taken. And they may be taken by a deliberate action of a government or entity related to the regime. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, you have these colectivos, as they're called, which basically are these armed motorcycle gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, including Tren de Aragua, that are involved.
Again.
So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans, because here's what we didn't want to see, and I don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, oh, he's gone, let's flood over there, let's all go over there, and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Tren de Aragua, but there were Tren de Aragua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them. We are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop. And I thank you.
Just on 2 points. We're not cooperating with them to continue doing what they're doing now. We're cooperating with them to transition away from what's happening now. And as I said, we're not even 4 weeks into this thing. And if it continues to look like this in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, if progress isn't being made, we'll have very different feelings about it. But what we're cooperating on is not the continuation of what's happening. It's a movement away from all this and transitioning ultimately to something that looks nothing like this. That's the goal. But it's been less than 4 weeks. I mean, we think we've made substantial progress in a very short period of time, but I acknowledge we want to make a lot more progress. This is not the end state that we want.
This exchange cut straight to a hard truth. Congress isn't doing its job, and the consequences are piling up fast. The lawmakers' frustration wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about silence. Hearings delayed. Oversight weakened. While billions in taxpayer dollars flow through foreign operations, Congress, according to this argument, has failed to act as the constitutional check it was designed to be. Money is being spent every day, tens of millions, with little public scrutiny. Entire regions see massive military and diplomatic buildups. Yet lawmakers are only now asking basic questions. That delay, the speaker warned, is how democratic guardrails erode. Then came Venezuela. The U.S. government itself warns Americans not to travel there under any circumstances. The risks are extreme. Arbitrary arrests, criminal gangs, armed militias, and government-aligned groups operating without accountability. Ordinary citizens live under intimidation. Dissent is punished. And yet, the criticism goes, the administration's policies don't line up with those warnings. On one side, officials acknowledge that armed groups still control large parts of Venezuelan society. On the other, they've begun lifting protections for Venezuelans living in the United States, some for many years, placing them back on deportation paths into that instability. To critics, that's not just inconsistent. It's dangerous. The administration's defense centers on security. Officials argue that earlier immigration protections were expanded too fast, without proper screening, allowing a small number of criminal actors to exploit the system. Ending blanket protections, they say, allows for tighter vetting and individual review. But skepticism runs deep. The lawmaker pushed back, arguing that this administration has blurred definitions before, labeling peaceful Americans as extremists while asking for trust abroad. Without transparency and real congressional oversight, assurances mean little. And then there's the bigger concern, cooperation. The administration insists engagement with Venezuela is meant to push the country toward reform, not to prop up repression. Diplomacy, they argue, takes time, and it's too early to declare failure. But critics warn that cooperation without accountability often becomes complicity. When repression continues, when militias remain armed, and when human rights violations persist, patience starts to look like permission. That's the line this exchange exposed, between strategy and surrender, between diplomacy and denial. This exchange wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a warning about what happens when oversight fades, when Congress stops pressing, when massive decisions are made without sustained accountability. Whether you agree with the administration or its critics, one thing is clear. Power without scrutiny is dangerous, especially when human lives and human rights are on the line. The real question isn't just what happens in Venezuela. It's whether Congress will finally step up and do the job the Constitution demands. Because if it doesn't, this crisis won't stay overseas.